Pro cycling is full of brilliant stories and stats. However, not all of them are true. Coming up, we are going to be debunking some of pro cycling's biggest myths. The rider known as the Badger won Paris Roubaix in 1981 whilst wearing the rainbow jersey. But he would often tell journalists how much he hated the race. In fact, he wrote in his own autobiography, "I've always said how much I dislike this race, and winning it didn't change my mind. I still dislike it. I can't see the point of taking cyclists over such roads. For the last 100 kilometres of the race, they're hardly roads at all." Now, it is perhaps understandable that the strongest rider of a generation dislikes a race such as Paris Roubaix. With a talent like Hinault's, he liked to do what he wanted, whenever he wanted. But with the unpredictability that cobbles introduced, his control over the race was lessened. Over the years though, his disdain for the race somehow morphed into the myth that he disliked it so much he never rode it until 1981. He then decided to race it in the rainbow jersey, won it, and then decided never to race it again. But that is nonsense. In fact, Hinault took to the start line of the Queen of the Classics on 7 separate occasions. After abandoning his first edition in 1976, he went on to finish 13th, 11th, 4th, 1st and 9th, and then abandoned again when he raced it for the final time in 1983. So, even though he did call it bull and a race for dickheads, he definitely rode it more than once. It often gets mentioned that whichever rider is wearing the number 51 on their back for the Tour de France is lucky, because this number has been worn by more Tour de France winners than any other. Now, it is true that some very prominent riders wore the number 51 when they won their first Tour de France, and all in fact in relatively quick succession. So, when Eddy Merckx first won the Tour in 1969, he was wearing number 51. As was his Spanish rival Luis Ocaña when he won the Tour in Merckx's absence in 1973. Then, when Merckx's Tour-winning reign was ended by Bernard Hinault in 1975, he also had number 51. And so too did Bernard Hinault in 1978 when he won the first of his 5 Tours. 4 major riders in the space of just 10 years all wore the number 51 for their maiden victory. But that's it, just 4. Those are the only times that number 51 has won the Tour de France. By far and away the number which has won the Tour de France most often in the race's history is, unsurprisingly when you think about it, the number 1. This is due to all of the wins by defending champions. The Tour has been won 26 times by a rider wearing the number 1, and that doesn't include Armstrong's 6 victories with that number. Even the numbers 2 and 11 have won the Tour more often than number 51. So this myth is well and truly busted. If you type into Google the 2 phrases Lance Armstrong and youngest ever, you will get about 40,000 search results. So there are literally thousands of sources, including reputable books and newspapers, which cite the fact that when Armstrong won the World Road Championships in Oslo in '93, he became the youngest ever men's world champion. He was 21 years of age when he did win it, which is very young to win that race, but he definitely was not the youngest. In fact, he wasn't even the second youngest. So, there were 2 riders that were younger when they pulled on the rainbow jersey. When the World Championships were held in Leicester back in 1970, the men's road race was won by a young Belgian by the name of Jean-Pierre Montserrat, and he was about a week younger than Lance Armstrong was when he won. Montserrat was one of the hottest prospects in cycling in 1970, and he proved that by taking the rainbow jersey. But sadly, he didn't get to wear it very long. He was killed the following spring when a car drove towards the riders in a race in Belgium. He was hit and he died almost instantaneously. Before Montserrat, another Belgian named Karel Kers won the rainbow jersey in 1934 in Leipzig, just 2 months after he turned 20. And that means that Kers is undoubtedly the youngest ever men's world road race champion. RENE VIETTO is one of the greatest climbers of all time that you may never have heard of. He won 4 stages and the King of the Mountains at the 1934 Tour de France at the age of just 20. And he probably would have won that tour as well had his team leader Antonin Magnier not pulled rank. So on stage 16, VIETTO was once again flying clear in the mountains and looked set to take the yellow jersey for the first time. But then Magnier broke his bike and demanded that VIETTO wait and give him his own bike. So VIETTO had to sit at the side of the road, in tears, before handing over his bike to Magnier, who went on to win the Tour. Now, despite that heartbreak in 1934, VIETTO did go on to establish himself as a leader for the Tour de France. So much so that there is a myth that VIETTO developed sepsis on one of his toes during the 1947 Tour and had to have it amputated. The story then goes that to show solidarity, VIETTO insisted that one of his key domestiques, LAZARIDES, cut off one of his toes as well, a whole new level of domestique duty. Now, it is true that VIETTO had his toe taken off by a doctor. However, it didn't happen during the Tour, but after it had ended, with VIETTO finishing 5th and winning 2 stages. And I'm afraid it's also not true that LAZARIDES lobbed one of his own toes off to match his leader. But rather bizarrely, although VIETTO himself died in 1988, his toe, chopped off in 1947, is still around. It is in a jar in the kitchen of an apartment in Marseille, owned by a man called RENE Bertrand, a rather toe-curling thought. Peter Sagan is one of the best cyclists of all time. His level of consistency is almost unparalleled in the modern era. He was 20 years old when he took his first professional victory, which was a stage of Paris back in 2010. Since then, he's won the World Champs 3 times, the green jersey at the Tour de France a record 7 times, 2 monuments, the Tour of Flanders and Paris Roubaix, and a whole host of other top-level races. But it's the stats related to his consistency that I find the most remarkable. Take the Tour de France, for example. He's won the green jersey every time he's competed there, except in 2017 when he was disqualified. In total, he's ridden 158 stages of the Tour and finished in the top 10 in 78 of them, just under half. And he's been in the top 3 there on 45 occasions, so that's 28% of the stages he's done. In 2014, it wasn't until stage 8 that he finished outside the top 5, and overall in his career, he's competed in 831 races, or stages of races, and finished in the top 10 418 times, over 50%. Absolutely incredible numbers when you really start thinking about them. It has been said, though, that his win rate doesn't match his consistency, and that he's finished in 2nd place more times than he's won. That is false. Sagan has 113 pro victories to his name, whilst he has finished 2nd only 105 times. He's also finished 3rd on 51 occasions though, so he has finished on the lower steps of the podium more times than he's won. The final stage of the Tour de France now follows the same pattern each year. A champagne sipping parade towards Paris, where the winners team lead the way onto the Champs-Élysées, at which point the racing proper commences. The stage is up for grabs and it's one of the most coveted wins for any sprinter, but the GC is already effectively done and dusted, as it's an unwritten rule that nobody attacks the yellow jersey on that final day. However, it hasn't always been like that. In fact, as recently as 1987, Stephen Roach was in the yellow jersey heading into the final day with a 40-second lead over Pedro Delgado. Roach was also leading the green jersey classification too though, and he was so concerned about an ambush from Delgado on that final stage that he made a pact with the sprinter Jean-Paul Van Poppel. He said that he would not try to defend his green jersey and would willingly concede it to Van Poppel if he and his Dutch Super Convex team agreed to help Roach keep an eye on Delgado and chase down any last gasp attacks. So clearly in 1987 there was no expectation of a procession into Paris. In the years directly after that, the lead on the final day was sufficiently large that a final move was highly unlikely to succeed anyway, with the notable exception of 1989, which of course ended in a time trial. By the time there was a closable gap on the final day, it was 2003, and by that time, the champagne procession had firmly taken hold and has remained tradition ever since. Back in the 1980s, there were so few American pro cyclists that there was no point in organising a specific race to determine who was the national champion. Instead, when Jack Boyer finished as highest placed American at the World Championships, he declared himself US national champion, and the governing body went along with it. At the World Championships again the following year, a certain Greg LeMond was present. The American riders got together and voted as to whether to ride as a team in order to try and win the rainbow jersey, or whether to ride as individuals and all aim for the national champions jersey by finishing as the highest placed American. The team voted, and they voted to ride as individuals. LeMond was furious, walking out of the team meeting in disgust as he had designs on the rainbow jersey. Freddie Martins won that race and no American finished inside the top 40. Then in 1982, the Americans were back at the Worlds, this time in Goodwood. Again, they voted on how to race, and again, they voted to race as individuals. This time though, Le Monde didn't argue because he said he was feeling terrible and didn't feel like he could do anything in the race anyway. But when the finale of the race arrived, Bowyer shot out of the bunch in the final straight and looked like he could hang on for the win. Then, suddenly Le Monde appeared and chased him down. However, he had the Italian Giuseppe Cerrone on his wheel, he took advantage, Le Monde dragged him up to Bowyer and Cerrone won. Le Monde did hang on for second and Bowyer got swamped and ended up in 10th. Now officially, Le Monde did chase down his own teammate, but despite the way it looks on the footage, the two Americans had agreed to race this way. Le Monde went on to win the rainbow jersey the following year in 1983. And finally, it is widely thought that Daniel Lloyd was a distinctly mediocre professional cyclist, and whilst that is true, the rumours that he never won a bike race are ludicrously embellished. In 2008, Lloyd competed at the world-famous Vuelta a Extremadura and was not only a part of the squad that won the opening day's team time trial, he also went on to win the general classification. Now, strictly speaking, the race is not a professional one, but he did beat the likes of Thiago Mercado, who would later go on to finish 5th at Liège-Bastogne-Liège. Lloyd himself would go on to ride the Tour de France, where he placed inside the top 30 on no fewer than one occasion. Right, those are our 8 cycling myths debunked. Have we missed any? You can let us know in the comments section just down below. Also, don't forget to download our GCN app if you haven't done so already. You'll find a link to that on the screen now. On the app, you'll find all the latest cycling news, plus hacks and bodges, inspirational photos, polls and quizzes, and much, much more.